I just started it.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone to the latest in our series, Historical Roots of Our Time, that the history department has been sponsoring, but really is a interdisciplinary effort where we reach out across the campus. And now two non-history department faculty are presenting in our series, which I think is great because it is both historical and it's also talking about the contemporary, which is exactly why we started this series. So the latest in our talks, a Protean disease, is going to be presented to us by Dr. Derek Skillings from the philosophy department and Dr. Michiel van Veldhuizen from the classical studies department. I want to let them do more of an introduction if they'd like to say more, but I'm going to sit back and enjoy this talk. And we're going to short presentations followed by a long Q&A. So just think of all the questions you have for our presenters, and we'll take it from there. All right.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jamie. So we'll get started in a moment. Screen sharing. I'll just do a little bit more of an introduction for myself. I'm in the classical studies department, and my research focuses on the ancient Greek world. I'm interested in how the Greeks think about disasters. Natural disasters, shipwrecks, how to try to make sense of events like that. And so besides disaster, I study divination because I think one way to understand which the Greeks understand disaster is through divination, oracles and such. And today's talk is partly connected to that research. Maybe Derek, do you want to say something as well?
Sure, I guess just to get the introductions both in a row. So I'm Derek Skillings. I'm in the philosophy department. Philosopher of science, philosopher of biology, but I sort of started as a biologist. So I was a marine population geneticist before I was a philosopher. But now I study mostly understanding biological individuality, so what kind of things there are in the world and how do we sort of determine that, looking in diversity. But I've started to do more work in philosophy of medicine, which is kind of what was one of the impetuses for bringing this together. And then just to, because I have just a little plug for other UNCG things going on, I'll be starting a biology and philosophy interest group. So basically anybody in the humanities or the natural sciences who are interested in sort of like conceptual, theoretical, big questions, things related to the natural sciences, we'll be having regular talks and reading groups and events across campus. But so stay tuned, kind of look for that, or just send me an email if you're interested.
Yeah, good. All right, well, let me start by sharing my screen so I can begin to explain why we named our talk the way we did, a Protean disease. I should say not protein, as some of my students to whom I mentioned thought. It's a reference to a character from Greek mythology, Proteus. This first drew our attention when Merriam-Webster noted that lookups of that word spiked by more than 5,000% sometime in June 2020, when Dr. Fauci had mentioned it in one of his speeches. And he said, and there's a video below, we're not going to watch it right now, but he said that I've never seen anything that is so Protean in its ability to make people sick or not as coronavirus, right? And so, Dr. Fauci, who was a classics major in college, might or might not be aware of the sort of the background that there is to the use of the word protein here. But it struck me as particularly significant, and it reminded me of the very sort of one of the earliest plague accounts we have from classical antiquity, and that is one by Thucydides, the famous historian who wrote about the Athenian plague, which sort of ravaged the city of Athens in 430 BCE. Estimates are that it might have killed about 25% of the population. But in his lengthy account, and I'm happy to talk more about that during the Q&A as well and things, but one of the things that stands out to me as someone trying to understand how Greeks trying to understand their disasters is that Thucydides says that the character of the disease proves such that it baffles description, right? This idea that it can't be captured. It can't be captured in the logos, as it says in the Greek. It's kreison logou, which is Greek for greater than reason, beyond description. And so on the one hand, Thucydides says that precisely because, as Dr. Fauci intends it as well, the disease is protean insofar as that it's shape-shifting. It continuously morphs and is the symptoms are so diverse that it's very hard to pin down exactly what it is and hence how to treat it. It seems too shapeshifty for our own good, I should say. So that on the one hand is this kind of first meaning of the word protean, I think, where it's really about the diversity of symptoms. And I should say Thucydides is not interested in causes at all. He says that explicitly. It also connects, and again, I assume this happened unwittingly. We speak like this, and I'm sure Dr. Fauci does as well. But the word protean actually activates a much longer discourse that has to do with plague accounts, like the one of Thucydides. And in fact, the last time that Europe was ravaged by the bubonic plague, in this case, was in the 18th century in the city of Marseille. And there we have various treatises from that period. And Marseille was a significant harbor city at the time, and the plague ravaging the city and the countryside claimed more than 100,000 lives. City was put under strict quarantine, which may seem familiar to us. The government put up the famous Mur de la Peste, the plague wall that you can still see remnants of today, which kind of was cordoned off the Provence, southern France from the north. But the point is that the plague became sort of the disaster of Enlightenment thought, and plague literature testifies to that, and there's an abundance of it. The remarkable thing is that one of the consistent things, and I give here a text by Jean-Baptiste Bertrand, who observes about the plague that it's a Proteus who changes shape every day. The remedies which were successful in the plague of one time, of one country, of one season, were not successful in others. And this image of this 18th century plague as a Protean disease keeps repeating itself. Here's an anonymous pamphlet that circulates in 1720 itself, so during the plague. It says, the plague would not have caused such cruel ravages in Marseille if it had not come as if by surprise. But it was so skillful at dissimulation that it disguised itself like another Proteus under different figures or symptoms which made it unrecognizable and thus deceived most of the physicians. And I think it is interesting here that in addition to this first meaning of the word protean, right? This idea that it's symptomatic, its symptoms are shape-shifting continuously, is this idea that a second kind of meaning emerges in these plague accounts. And that has to do with the fact that it seems that it is like a Proteus in the sense that it is hard to capture in discourse, right? That everything that's happening when the plague overwhelms the city is so overwhelming, and again, we might recognize this, that it's hard to make sense of it, and it's hard to put it into words, even to put it into a cohesive narrative, to enclose it within discourse, if you will. And this really takes off among Enlightenment philosophers such as Diderot, who start writing about the plague, and who note that, and again, this sounds eerily familiar, that the plague doesn't only destroy relations among citizens, but communication among parents, and breaks the entire bond of society. All right, people, it's the perversion of communication, because they realize that the disease itself is communicated by society itself. And so whereas the Enlightenment had prided itself on the exchange of ideas, of text, of goods, of wealth as central to the new age, it seems that the plague undoes all of that. And again, having lived myself through several, what feels like several months, and it is several months of quarantine, it is significant. So here we find this kind of second idea of Protean as the inability to enclose it in discourse. That leads me to one more meaning of the word Protean, perhaps, that is closer to this mythological figure itself. Because why it gets the meaning, shape-shifting, is because the mythological figure of Proteus, whom we encounter in Homer's Odyssey, for example, is a sea god who you need to wrestle if you want to extract information out of it. So it's various heroes like Menelaus, and in this image here on the left, Heracles, who is wrestling a kind of a functional relative of Proteus, and that's the sea god Nereus, who operates the same way, is that once you find this sea god, you need to enclose him. You need to bind him so tight, and you can see that our ancient vase painter here has used a geometric pattern to indicate the tightness of that bond, of that encircling. And once you've encircled this creature, it will try to escape. It will try to get away from you, and it will morph into a lion, into water, into fire, into wild beasts, into all sorts of things. That's what water deities do in Greek mythology. Until finally it has run the gamut of its metamorphoses, and it returns to its own self, defeated. All right. And at that point, you get to ask it your question. And usually for heroes, that's where do I go next? What do I do? But it's significant for us in our context in particular, in that Proteus has this special knowledge, which once extracted allows, and this is in various versions, in particular a famous one from Virgil's Georgics, where Proteus is captured by a shepherd called Aristaeus, who wants to know why his bees are dying. Once he does that, once he captures Proteus, only then, captured, in this tight embrace, will it give up the cause of the disease and explain the remedy that allows, in Aristaeus' case, his bees to be reborn. So it seems that the disease, and from this discourse that exists and goes back to antiquity, that a disease can be Protean insofar as it shapeshifts its symptoms, which is what Dr. Fauci seems to be referring to, but also in the sense that it resists attempts to be enclosed in discourse. And finally, Protean insofar as it contains crucial knowledge that can indicate both cause and remedy. And I think that resonates especially for us in COVID times as well, because the coronavirus itself, as we understand viral material, is in a way a packet of data, genetic information that the boundless proliferation of which is both the monster's success, but when decoded and when captured and enclosed, potentially its downfall. So I'll have more to say probably, but let me, with these thoughts, pass it off to Derek and see what he'd like to.
I think will you be able to just keep on controlling for?
Yeah, I can do that.
I have a couple more slides as well, but they're a lot sillier.
Let me move past this. I'll come back.
All right, so I want to pick up on a couple of different things. One of them being is what might we mean sort of in a more modern context, or at least like explanatory context, what Fauci means here as Protean, because there's a bunch of meanings that kind of get run together that I think are useful to kind of pick it apart, especially when we've got something as complex as the pandemic. So one way we might understand that Protean is this, what's called, and when we're talking about genetic diseases or we're talking about genes and the relations to the trait, it's called Pleotropy, which means that one thing has many different effects or it's sort of, we get sort of a one-to-many relation. So I've got or if anybody's familiar with the Ninja Turtles cartoon, one way or the other, we've got this one thing, mutagen. You interact with it, and it has all these different sorts of effects. It's hard to predict, like, so what the sort of the symptoms are going to be, or how you're going to get transformed after you come into contact with it. And so, in part of when Fauci and others are talking about the protean nature, this, and especially Fauci when he follows that up to sort of clarify, is he seems to have something like this in mind. We've got one virus, we got the coronavirus, and it is got all of this wide range of effects. Some people are not affected at all. Some people have basically cold-like symptoms. Some people are having to go having long-term pneumonia-like symptoms. Some people are going on respirators. Some people are going on ventilators, and then some people are dying. So we get this like wide, huge range of possibilities. And so that's what he's talking about earlier on. It's like it's really hard to predict what's going to happen because there's so many ways that people are reacting to this one virus. So that's the one way to think of this, kind of this non-specificity of effect. One cause, lots of different effects, and it's really kind of hard to pin down what that effect's going to be. And it was just really important, especially if we're trying to predict something. And then, so sort of related is, but going in the other direction, sort of the many to one, is we might think of in terms of you're going to have you have one effect with many causes, which is, so say you want to have a good time. How do you have a good time? Well, there's many different ways to have a good time. They're all going to result in a good time. You could go to a party, you go to a dinner, you could come to an HNAC talk. Every way you're guaranteed to have a good time. And so this, we kind of think of this as the other. And so when we're talking about in disease, this is especially genetically related disease or traits, not even necessarily have to be disease. I often think of this as polygenic. So many genes causing one trait. But in this context, you might want to think about it as like causal non-specificity. So given a certain effect, we don't know what the cause is. So a disease like this, we think with, so like Parkinson's is like this. Parkinson's disease, for many people, it's got genetic causes, but you can also get Parkinson's by getting hit in the head and getting brain damage to a very specific part of your brain. You can get it from pesticides that affect a certain part of your brain. So we've got sort of one effect, but there's all sorts of causes that are each sufficient for that effect, which is historically when you're trying to pin down what the plague is, or you're trying to pin down a disease or disease organism, that becomes the difficult part. If you're going to prevent it, you got to figure out what's causing it. And if you're seeing the same sorts of results from many types of causes, then that's going to make it really difficult to kind of pin down. But then there's a third reason. So the sort of like, when I think of this sort of the Proteus nature of it is doesn't have to do with the cause and effect relationships, but just say about viruses and things like the coronavirus and the variants themselves. So you get shape shifting. So this sort of are mutations. So here we've got the T-1000 from the classic Terminator movie. So this is not about there being different effects or different causes that are linked in various ways, like the first two examples. It's just you have the same thing that is changing what it's like over time. And so this becomes a big problem, especially when thinking viral diseases. And if we look at the variants, it's like, okay, we think we've got it under control. We've got a vaccine that we've got a new variant that comes in. And this is different than saying that the same thing has given us many different sort of exposure effects. That first nature of, or sort of notion of protean, where we can't really pin down a specific effect to a single cause or multiple causes to a single effect. Here, we've got something that's related, but the causes and the effects are changing themselves as they go. They're shifting shapes, shifting. Yeah. Could we, let's see, go on the next slide. I mean, and this is a well-known in the history of disease, and there's been lots of sort of standard protocols to try to get around this problem. So the most famous, so we're trying to say like pinning down Proteus to try to figure out what's there, so we can figure, so we can plan, we can predict, we want to know how are we going to cure this disease, how are we going to predict what's going to happen next, how are we going to inform, make preventative measures. But when it comes to biological causes of disease, so Koch's postulates are historically have been the standard. And I'll just kind of run through this real quick. Is that, so what happens is you have a healthy organism and you have a diseased organism. And so you have healthy and unhealthy people. And what you try to do, the first sort of step is, well, we're going to have to try to figure out what's the difference between the healthy and the diseased, the plague-ridden and the healthy, is, well, let's see if we can find that variable. What is that bacteria? Well, at the time it was, don't know what it was, but what is that bacteria or virus that's causing? And so the gold standard of this is that you find an agent that's only present, of course, in the diseased people. But that's not enough. You can't just find that difference, because you don't know if that's a correlation. It could be that the disease causing organism is going to do A, give you the disease, and B, cause you to lose your hair. And it's not the losing of your hair that causes the disease, it's the fact that they're both caused by the same thing. But there could be these correlations or secondary infections, things that you can, these sorts of things. So what you need to do is you need to isolate that putative causative agent and grow it on its own, sort of make more of them, so we can show like, okay, this thing is both alive and it's in the diseased organism. We got it in growth. And then we've purified, we've isolated it. We know here's the thing that we think might cause it. And still, that's not going to be enough, because now all we know is we've isolated the thing that could be correlative, for all we know. So then what we need to do is then take that, that is, let's say like the pure culture organism, and infect somebody with it, or infect a mouse with it. See what happens. And if they get the disease, then we've got pretty good evidence that it was that thing that we isolated and cultured and then reinjected that is causing the disease. And then, but it could be just, again, due to chance, maybe disease and remission again. So what then you need to do again is, the fourth step is re-isolate that causative agent. So this is the kind of the gold standard. You're going through all this struggling through, trying to pin down what it is that's trying to cause. But this has become very difficult then for a lot of complex diseases. So when Koch's doing, we're using it to isolate cholera. So we've got a single bacterium that's causing a disease. But we've got all sorts of, now we're sort of expanding our notions of diseases. In some ways, when we think of like colitis, which is sort of an inflammation of the gut, it's sometimes caused by a single bacterium, but it's often caused by a whole community. Sometimes when those communities make changes, sometimes a particular proportion of some bacterium to another. So you're not able to isolate it, because there are many causes for the same effect. So we're getting these multi-causal complex causes that are hard to pin down. And so a lot of just sort of these like endemic diseases, or like kind of the diseases of people that, you live in populations, and they're not diseases where they're maybe necessarily transmittable, although sometimes they are. But there are cases where they're just persistent. And that's because often is that the causes are so complex that it can be hard to isolate. But this is you see if you look at something like coronavirus, the early papers don't fulfill something like Koch's postulates because this actually isn't possible with a virus. Because with a virus, you can't isolate it on its own because a virus needs cells to complete its life cycle. Viruses mutate so often, but the main thing is that it infects and it becomes part of your cells. So there's lots of other ways we try to, others have updated Koch's postulates, this sort of historical gold standard for thinking about causes and effects. And you do that, like, so, genotype scanning, but then we've got this standard, which we want to say, like, we can isolate the thing that's causing the disease, we can give it back to something that's healthy, and we can see that it causes the disease again. And this is really, really problematic and really hard for things like viruses that can't live on their own, but also for a lot of these really complex sort of like the diseases of modernity that they're not like cholera. They're not like the plague, where you've got basically one single highly pathogenic variable that it's pretty clear. It has such a strong effect that you get it, chances are you're going to get sick or die. Like, very few people are resistant to it. And so it's easier to track down to that one-to-one relation, but there's lots of sort of like disease and modernity it's a much difficult process. And something else so I'll leave it at there for the break. One other thing I wanted to kind of say in response to, I love this quote about the plague is greater than reason. Because if you're like me and a lot of other people, I mean, when you're following the coronavirus, it seems like everybody all of a sudden becomes an expert on the coronavirus, and then everybody's an expert on like elections, and then everybody's an expert on international politics in Ukraine, and but with coronavirus, it's been this entire, and Fauci's kind of been for the U.S. at least, kind of the spokesperson, or sort of seen to be like he's the expert on that. But anything like this, it's too big for one person to understand, especially when we're trying to do things like predictions. And it's easy to see why. I mean, the person who can understand spike proteins and the phylogeny of viruses, that's an entirely different skill set than somebody who looks at, say, viral infections in wild animals that might transfer, so zoonotic diseases. That's going to be different from the sort of person who is an epidemiologist who can predict demographic movements and how viruses are spread. That's going to be a much different set of skills than somebody who can who understands fluid dynamics in air. So when we've got coughing and how that's going to cause things to spread, which is going to be very different than the sort of person who is going to need to know how to, like, how is our hospital system going to respond to a sudden influx of patients? In all of these, it's such a wide variety of skills that, like, it can sort of feel just, I mean, it's impossible to know what's going to happen. In that sort of way that it's impossible because we can't look back historically and try to, like, okay, here's the way that, and now we can see in retrospect, this is why what happened. But when something like the coronavirus and something like a plague comes through, it's happening so quickly, and we need to more than just understand it. We need to be able to predict what's going. I mean, that becomes the important bit, is predicting it so that we can intervene. And that's I mean, things moving so fast with so many variables, with so many, necessary, like every one of those things I listen, there's many more, I think, are all crucial. You miss one of those and you're probably going to really screw up your prediction about how it's going to go. You don't understand mutation rates in viruses. You don't understand zoonotic transmission. You don't understand, like, air dynamics and sort of transfer on planes or in rooms. You don't understand population movements. You miss just one of those steps and you're probably going to get it completely wrong. And so it's bringing together a lot of people. So this idea that it's these plagues are greater than reason, I think, because of that breakdown, but just also because of how they take over everything, and how you need to know so much very specific information to be able to, from so many different perspectives, to be able to make the sort of predictions that, or to have the sort of response that you're going to want to have in up to a plague or to a pandemic as it's unfolding. And so this idea that it's too big for one person, I think, is it's literally true, that it is greater than our reason when we think of greater than one person's reason. But I think I'll stop there. I think that's my 10 minutes or so as well, and I'm looking forward to the conversation and questions.
Yeah, I thought I'd chime in one more time and follow up on the very last thing you said, Derek, which is great, I mean, right now, our society, and you talk about this, knowledge, specialized knowledge is so spread out that it's very hard to, there's no singular discourse, scientific or otherwise, that contains it all, right? And this is, of course, not the case in antiquity, where in a way, what happens to Thucydides' plague account is that it becomes that authoritative, singular discourse to which, well until the 18th century, authors would refer to be like, well, let's see what Thucydides says. He says, well, this is clearly this, right? So Thucydides says, guys, this is Chryson logo, right? This is great. And yet he attempts that logos, right? And so he explicitly says that he doesn't think there is a cure, but he writes it down, be detailed with all the symptoms, so that people may recognize it when it comes again. And so, and when you have these 18th century pamphleteers and 18th century scientists trying to figure out what the hell's going on in Marseille, it's exactly that they're saying, well, this is exactly what Thucydides said would happen. This idea that when you're in it, it seems Chryson logo, and it seems bigger than any accounting we can give. And so the sort of that reference work, rather than the attempt to capture it in logos, which we attempt to do nowadays sort of horizontally, is in a way then attempted vertically. That is to say, sort of back in time, looking at past, and of course that's not absent from our discourse either. It's just that that knowledge is spread out so much in the academy and in society in general. Yeah, great. I hope this is food for thought, and even if it seems at least to demonstrate the usefulness of taking sort of varied perspectives to a singular even pronouncement, right? So let's see if there's any questions. I mean, we can chat on forever, probably.
Could you all stop sharing your presentation and see if we have any questions for our presenters? Joanne.
Hi, thank you so much. This is great. I'd like to hear a bit more about the Marseille situation. Like when exactly was that? I think I missed that, but also how long did it go on for? I really like the kind of way they were talking about it, that is affecting all these different places differently. So it was interesting, kind of mirrored the New York Times of the last few years.
Yeah, right. So the plague of Marseille is the last sort of big wave of the bubonic plague. I'm not sure how long it lasts entirely, but it first breaks out in 1720. And it's as so often, and this is how the plague comes to Athens as well. And of course, there is a great interest in tracking where a pandemic or a disease comes from, right? We are too obsessed, right? Did the bats bring it? Do we need to find it in the food market, the wet markets, China? No, it's a lab, this idea that it comes from somewhere and that it's nefarious. We see that in Thucydides, where, it's clear where it comes from. At least the Greeks say it comes from Egypt, Ethiopia, Egypt, and then travels to the harbor, Piraeus, which is a reasonable enough assumption, historians think. And then there's immediately the fallout, people thinking that the Spartans, with whom the Athenians are at war at the time, have poisoned the wells. That's where the pathogen comes from. But Thucydides himself dismisses that. In the case of Marseille, it's also a ship. I'm not sure where exactly it comes from. We do know, but the people go. They are supposed to quarantine off sea. They do that for a while, but still the disease makes it into the town itself. And the central government of France cordons off the entire Provence and digs new canals to make sure that they know something about cleanliness and water and stuff like that. In terms of the discourse, it fits very neatly into this idea that at this time, where the Enlightenment philosophers are interested in, okay, what is the greatest evil of them all, and that gets the name plague, which becomes the kind of new the latest manifestation of the evil that encompasses all other evil. Why? Because it breaks down the society we've built, right? Which is based upon exchange. And with that being perverted, because everyone knows that somehow that contagion is a thing and that it communicates, they just don't know how. It becomes the ultimate face of evil. And so people will say, Diderot will write, of all the evils in the world, plague is the greatest. There's famine, there's war, but of all the God-created evils, plague is the worst. Which again, there are biblical plagues that seem to emphasize this idea as well, that it's a choice in that sense among other evils. And again, this Thucydides speaks in similar ways about it. There was one more thing I wanted to add, which is that we do have this for the first time, the explanation as to in Marseille that there might be tiny little creatures that are causing the contagion of the plague. That opinion is dismissed at the time, but it seems to be a first insight into understanding microbial spread of disease in all sorts of ways. Many people think that fear itself causes people to die. So there's really four theories at this time, two of which come from antiquity. One is that there's contagion, right? You touch and you get sick. The second is miasma, that is polluted air that sort of wafts across and will settle down on your water supply and cause it. The third one is these tiny little creatures, an explanation which for the first time we see in Marseille. And the fourth one is panic itself, which kills. I'll say one thing about this idea of contagion, which exists together with miasma in antiquity itself, and that is that Derek mentioned this idea about ideally how do you pin Proteus down, right? You have a diseased specimen and you have a healthy specimen. In the discourse of plague, both in Thucydides and in the later tradition that follows it as well, that is precisely the problem, because it is so all-encompassing that there's this idea that there's a blurring of these categories. So the moment, and Thucydides points this out, and he's of course not incorrect probably, that the doctors get sick first because they try to go to the patients, but immediately they fall sick and they die before they can do anything, And so there's this idea that this distinction between a healthy body and a diseased body collapses, and that becomes sort of one big mix, which is in itself symptomatic for the condition of plague that has broken out. So
thank you.
We have any other questions for our presenters? I know I have a number of my colleagues here, but we also have some students who are on. Any questions? Jesse, what is your question?
Hi. Yeah, so it was kind of a side point, I think, but I was wondering if Derek would say a little bit more about comparing historical diseases to contemporary diseases. I found that a really kind of interesting point, that the nature of the disease might have actually changed over time, or maybe I misheard, but I was wondering if he could say a bit more about that.
Yeah, I might have said something around the nature of diseases change, but if I didn't mean to say that. It's more of the sense that like along a lot of these persistent diseases that we've known for a long time, but that are just kind of, they're persistent in the sense of that they're always with, not like cholera, not with like plagues or that kind of like might sweep through a population, and even things like the flu or the cold, that they're kind of there and then they go. In some ways, those are kind of like the low-hanging fruit because of the fact that we can isolate. There's a single cause to them. I mean, so it makes sense that like the diseases that we figured out first were the ones that had with a very, very strong effects. And that effect was caused by one variable. And so when it's a communicable disease, you have something that you can isolate and you can kind of pick out. But a lot of those sort of the diseases of modernity, I sort of think about like once we're able to get rid of a lot of the viral, the pathogen, we don't have the plague around for the most part anymore. We're starting to get, for large parts of the world, be able to get rid of malaria and all of these sorts of diseases. So but we still have heart disease, and we still have genetic diseases that are kind of, they're kind of looked at, but you have one symptom or one, you might have one effect, but multiple different causes. And it's really hard to pin down, both because it's just the causal networks are too complex to maybe sort of pull apart. And with time we get better at this. But there's just a lot more variables to pick apart. But there's also, like with Parkinson's, it's not just that there's a complex network of variables, like we might think of like a lot of heart disease cases or a lot of cancer cases. There's some cases where there's just too many interacting environmental and genetic traits that are to people. But in like Parkinson's and some kinds of cancer, it's because some types of Parkinson's are caused by a genetic variant, and some causes of Parkinson's are caused because somebody hit their head in the right spot, or they were or exposed to pesticides. And so there we have the same sort of effect, and it's harder to pin down like what is the cause of Parkinson's, not because there's a complex causal network. It's because, oh well, it turns out that there was two causes, and they kind of converge in that there's a problem with dopamine producing nerves in a certain part of the brain. But I think that's like is kind of the way I'm trying to capture it, is that in a way that a lot of those plagues are low-hanging fruit in the sense of trying to figure out what they are, because strong effects, singular causes, and then they kind of come and go. Whereas these sorts of diseases like heart disease, these sort of diseases that take years to manifest, that have multiple causes, that we're thinking like are polygenic in terms of a lot of genetic diseases where there's more than one gene variant, more than one gene that's responsible for the disease. So it's not just about, with a lot of genetic diseases early on, we thought, well, great, we're sequencing the genome, we've got this genetic technology, we're going to be able to just get rid of all of these genetic diseases. There was lots of excitement about that. And for some diseases, that was the case. Phenylketonuria, where you get there's one mutation, you can isolate that, and you can either do, sort of screening early on to see if there's an immune issue. with a child, and so you can give supplementary medication. But it turns out that a lot of those inherited diseases, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of things working in concert to create that disease, and that's just an entirely different kind of situation. And so I think that Protean nature of we talk about, there's lots of things he could have meant, but I mean, lots of ways I think that it kind of resounds for that sort of diseases. One is, look, and I don't even think he meant this. There's lots of different variants. The disease itself changes over time. It's mutating. The virus is mutating, and we're getting different variants of that disease. But he also mentioned it in this way of like this sort of causal structure, is that like one variant, the one variant we're looking at right now, the one that's coming in, that it itself, just that one variant, causes so many different kinds of presentations, and we don't really know how to predict, other than some, with age and weakened immune system. But beyond that, we don't know why some people it's barely a cold and other people are on ventilators, so you get that, and then of course you combine that, those two sort of, that shape shifting along with this this many-to-many causal interactions, and then we start to get a real sort of, you get this sort of like nightmare of like, how do we figure out what's going on? And as soon as we do figure it out, it's changed to something else, and now it's changing sort of as we go. But I think, yeah, so that sort of, that distinction of it ran together a little bit about what I meant by like the diseases of modernity, but these sorts of, because the coronavirus is one of these interesting cases where it is a contagion. It is basically one causal agent, but it is, everything's happening so fast, and you need so many different types of expertise to kind of even just get a handle on what's happening.
Thank you.
It becomes almost like a whole new type of thing.
Any other questions for our presenters? I was thinking of, I mean, the kind of Protean dynamic of what you both have been talking about seems like a matter of scale. I saw, it was in February of 2020, probably was in the New York Times, a diagram of one restaurant in Guangzhou where they had the tables laid out, and they showed where airflow had caused infection to spread from one table to another table. That seemed at that moment to explain something, because things were contained enough. So this seemed like you could actually understand something of the spread, whereas that was irrelevant. And in the big picture of what happened, that was just a nothing event. So kind of this, like Thucydides, understanding the plague doesn't help at the scale that we're facing these other threats from this particular coronavirus, pandemic. We don't have the capacity to kind of understand it through history or through example or anything. We just don't have those kind of examples. So I've just found this aspect of what you were both been talking about to be fascinating. It would be nice if we come out of this pandemic having some model that we can go to say we'll predict the next one, but I have a feeling we probably won't.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point as well. I mean, because what we're trying to understand, like in the one case, like the restaurant case, we might be trying to understand, like, how do I going to get coronavirus from my friends or from the people that I'm interacting with? And there it might really matter, like, well, what kind of places do you hang out with? Do people wearing masks? Is there lots of airflow? Are you inside or outside? And that really matters for the transmissibility on that scale. But if you wanted to know, like, how is it going to spread from this city to that city, or from this side of the country, then knowing the weather, the airflow patterns is going to be nothing, because really you need to know how people are moving around. And so, yeah, that sort of like scale, but also just like what part of it are you trying to understand? You just get very, very different answers. And of course, I mean, going by sort of many very, very different kinds of expertise that are needed to, and I found that to be sort of one of the really frustrating parts of just watching this unfold. It's just like, how many people who thought like, oh, I know this, so I'm going to say, I mean, I felt a bit hesitant to come in today even to say like, okay, we're going to talk about coronavirus. I'm like, oh, well, I mean, I am not an expert on almost anything to do with the coronavirus. So I'm not going to try to like weigh in or like, should I do this? Should I wear masks or not? Should we? What is the next variant going to look like? I don't know any more than anybody else when it comes to that. But I think there was this sort of unfortunate sense of like transfer of expertise. Well, this person's good at that, so they must know this other bit. But also people just taking it on. Oh, I know how it's going to work. It worked this way before, so it's going to work. It worked this way before, it's going to work this way again. Well, it didn't. Probably won't, unfortunately.
I'll say, to me, those are all strategies, kind of Protean strategies, to try to come to terms, to grip with something that seems out of our control. And in that sense, they are, I remember in the beginning of the pandemic, I was wiping, Amazon would deliver a package and we wipe it down because, it seemed, people said that it might be spread that way. So that's what you do, because that's something we've seen before somewhere else and it is familiar. And so, I would, not being a virologist or a coronavirus expert, it's not up to me to make recommendations, but it's interesting to see that in the development of this pandemic, just as we see sort of, I think, throughout history, are these attempts to, in our sort of societal discourse, to try and come up with strategies to pin it down, to assign some kind of meaning to it. It is a remarkable movement, interpretive movement, I think, on the part of Thucydides to claim, and really kind of radical even, to claim that there is no cure, right? That this is something that, because he says, we probably will, the causes are beyond us. I just have these symptoms and they're insane, right? And so I'm not going to try to figure out the cause. I think nobody can, he says, but it's just these set of symptoms that I'll hand to you here, and I've written them down. And in terms of that little bit of expertise, Thucydides claims that he himself had it and recovered from it. And it is worth pointing out that when we say plague here, this doesn't mean bubonic plague as it did in Marseille. The Greeks call loimos, which means, we translate it as plague, but it sort of historical, people that do historical medicine have tried to figure out, based on the description, what Thucydides' plague really was. And, people have come up with 25 different answers trying to identify the particular pathogen that's at stake here. But if anything, the text gives us a great glance at an attempt at meaning making amidst this disruptive event in Athenian society. And in that sense, it's a remarkable document.
Yeah, I think that's where, if maybe not the cynicism of like, we're never going to understand it, but just that, at least the humility bit about it, like, well, we don't understand this. When you're talking about like, well, wiping it down or wearing masks, like, because there was a lot of, there still is like how could they have told us this? Like, now in this day and age, how did we not know exactly what the cause is and how this was going to work? And instead, where it's like, well, let's be cautious. There's sort of a precautionary principle. We don't know whether it's going to be surface contact. We don't know whether or not it's going to be respiratory fluids. But it's a big enough deal that we should just be very careful about it. And it's how much anger there was after the fact that people didn't know the answer. And that's just, but to be able to say with some humility, like, yeah, we don't know. But we can still do something about like precautionary. There's all sorts of precautions. So be cautious.
Yeah, I think that we have very limited tolerance for uncertainty, that and we don't expect that from the scientific community either, and so it seems that, to me, it shows very clearly that pandemic unleashes this sort of eruption of uncertainty in society, cause, effect, it's all, and we have a hard time dealing with that as human beings, I think.
Any other questions for our presenters today? And two fascinating presentations, and because this series is all about discussion and discourse, so whatever it is, whether we have the answers or not, we keep the conversation going. I think that's the important part. I was going to add one thing from my field, from looking at Chinese texts from the 8th through the 15th century. The miasmic mists are the big deal, and they're all located in the south. So southern China, dangerous place, especially if you come from the north to the south, you're bound to run into one of these mists, and that's it. But they haven't yet pinpointed exactly what it was that the text writers were talking about in that case. We have another couple of minutes. I do want to mention in this series, we have another talk on April 7th, speaking about memory and commemoration of Ukraine's involvement, the Holocaust in Ukraine, by a Ukrainian scholar who's currently in Romania and may be returning to Ukraine before we give this presentation. But this is going to be on April 7th at noon. So I just wanted to make a plug for that. I want to thank Derek and Michiel for speaking to us today in this series, and for the audience for coming and taking time on this another happening to be a beautiful day, but it's nice to be in conversation with each other, even if it's virtually now. I just really want to thank our speakers for giving us this chance to reflect on this important issue here.
And thank you for the invitation. There was one question in chat that wasn't directed. It wasn't for me, but I don't know if there's still time.
Connor, yes, let's address it. In the ancient world, what would be the people living at the time have done to prevent getting sick, or would they have done anything?
Yeah, that's a good question. Disease prevention is a topic we don't know very much about in the ancient world. But it seems that once there is talk that there is pestilence or what they generally call this kind of disease that spreads, right? An epidemic of some kind, one that comes, epidemic is a Greek word. It comes from outside into the demos among the people. Then people would try to move away, which is a strategy that we see up until the 18th century, which is why they cordoned off Marseille. Italians move out of the city. There's always a debate sort of throughout this kind of history whether you should leave the city or whether the countryside is actually safer or not. And you find this, for example, in Boccaccio's Decameron, which is told during a plague, whether there seems to be uncertainty as to whether it's actually better to flee the city or not. Whereas other accounts are very clear that the cities are the most dangerous places to be because of the close cohabitation. But there's a story in antiquity that the plague in Athens was actually finally resolved by Hippocrates, the famous doctor, which is an apocryphal story. It can't be true for various reasons, but it was told, and it seemed to suggest that the way in which Hippocrates did it is in techniques that we have seen throughout history, and that is through fumigation. You try to purify the air, and so that is one way to do it. But again, for Thucydides, sort of the key characteristic of the plague is that people tried to do stuff, but all of that broke down immediately. Priests, doctors, the divine, all of that was abandoned. And so for Thucydides, the point is in a way precisely that you can't do anything. So I'll say that.
Well, thank you again for a wonderful presentation, and I hope everyone has a good rest of the day and can avoid all the things that we've been talking about here as much as possible.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
No plagues. All right. Thank you.
Bye.